Thanks, Les. And I'm really glad I wore a suit and tie today. As Les says, my day job is as Group Director of HSSE and Integrity Assurance for Petrofac, but I'm here as the Chair of the HTG. And actually I've been involved in helicopter safety since I was part of the Helicopter Task Group under Bob Keeler's chairmanship, which followed up the dreadful accident off Peterhead, the 85N, coming back from the Miller platform. And that task group was seen to do such valuable work that it was morphed into what we have now, the Helicopter Safety Steering Group under Step Change, and I've been part of that since its inception. And even though I wear a suit and tie, I do still fly in helicopters. And I'm passionate about the Step Change agenda, but I'm particularly passionate about aviation safety and the helicopter safety agenda. I'm going to canter through this because I think the best value we'll get this morning is if we have good questions and good discussion. So I don't want to spend too long with PowerPoint, and I'm going to hand over to Andrew to give you a helicopter manufacturer's perspective. In the room we have a number of people who are involved in the Helicopter Safety Steering Group and also the Helicopter Task Group. Jake and John Taylor in the back there are part of that, as is Tim Glasspool from Bristow's, who's on this table here, and indeed both Terry and Bob have been involved in some of the discussions we've had. What I'm going to do is explain what those two groups are, how they're formed and who sits on them. I'm going to summarise what we know about what happened in the Shetland accident, who's doing what in the various enquiries that you may have been reading about in the paper and the various reviews, and what's the timeline for getting some information out of those reviews. What part are we playing as the Helicopter Task Group, and what else is going on in the background? And then, as I say, I'll hand over to Andrew, and between us we'll hope to leave some time for questions and discussion. We've been producing quite a lot of materials. You've got some on the table. We also have a large poster which you can take away, the big cardboard box over there. If you go and see the lovely Emily in coffee, she'll give you one of those. It's actually suitable for putting up offshore. It tells the story of the EC225 issue very well. And there's more coming. We're turning out fact sheets, and I hope you're seeing the newsletters that we've been pushing out, and also you've seen some of the FAQ documents that we've tried to help people understand what's going on. Okay, so HTG, HSSG, basically what we have at the Helicopter Safety Steering Group is a group which includes clients of the helicopter operators themselves, helicopter manufacturers, the trade unions, we've mentioned John and Jake, and also behind them the elected safety reps. And we have our regulators, the CAA and the HSE, and on occasion EASA have an input too. And really what we've done with the formation of two smaller groups, and we needed to make two smaller groups to make it effective and more nimble. So we've got a dozen people working on the HTG, which is a subset, as you'll see, and the colour codes are the same as are used in the main diagram. And also a comms group, which is helping to pull together the information that we're getting out. And what we're doing at the HTG is basically trying to capture the concerns that are around from the workforce, monitor the progress of the various investigations, identify any safety improvements we can quickly make and communicate the progress on those to you, and engage with those independent reviews so that we're both providing input as well as monitoring their output. And the comms group works to support us and the HSSG in communicating those messages and providing those materials. So what do we know? I'm going to go quickly through this because I hope you're all in the picture. We still have an AAIB investigation going on. They are very thorough. They take a lot of time to get that technically right. It may still be many months before we get a final report. But we have had some interim reports, I think not least because there's been pressure from the industry to say, please tell us what you found so far and what's been going on. And from that, we know a number of things. So we know there was no mechanical or technical failure with the aircraft. We know they were flying very low because of the weather conditions. They were on approach to Sombra. And we know that from the black box, so-called, the flight data that is recorded, that the aircraft was flying very low, and it got very slow, I beg your pardon, and it got slower still, to a point where that's really unsustainable to flight. And not many people know, but there is a condition. Helicopters can stall just in the same way that an aircraft can stall. And when that happens, it essentially drops suddenly. We know from the data that the rate of descent increased, and it basically hit the water a little under 2 miles off the end of the runway in Sombra. We know that when it did, it was upright, the engines were running, so there was no problem with the engines, there was no problem with fuel, we know the gearbox was intact, we know the rotor systems were working. We also know that it was a very sudden event, and the aircraft did that everybody's worst nightmare. It immediately turned over and capsized, and we know that we lost 4 people of the 18 POB on board, including the 2 pilots. There were 14 survivors only. So what's happening now? Well, you'll have seen lots of different things, and it appears a little bit uncoordinated sometimes. A number of different reviews. So we have the helicopter operators getting together to look at whether they have collectively got the best practices and procedures, and to review the way that they do things in terms of operations. We've got the formal inquiries. The police are involved in this investigation because it's a fatal accident, and they are obliged to report in Scotland to the Procurator Fiscal, who will consider fatal accident inquiries in due course. We've got the main inquiry, the technical inquiry, and I've talked about that. We've already had a couple of bulletins, interim bulletins from the AAIB. They are very thorough. We will get chapter and verse ultimately, but we already know enough to be able to start to work on some of the issues. Fatal accident inquiry is to come at some point. We know about that. And the UK CAA and Norway CAA, jointly with EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, have announced that they are going to do a review. And you'll have seen press speculation that actually, Norway's much safer than the UK, and why is that? It's not the case, in fact. If you look at the statistics, it's the statistics of small numbers. And what you find is in the last 30 years, for 2 of the 10-year periods, the UK has had a better performance than Norway. And in the last 10 years, it's been the other way around. But the 2 ditchings that we had, and we've talked about EC225 to you, those 2 gearboxes could easily have been fitted to aircraft that were working in Norway. There's no real technical reason why those accidents happened, or those incidents happened in the UK. And we've also had the politicians announce that the select committee that looks after transport is going to hold its own review. That will particularly look at is the regulator, the CAA, doing its job properly. But they've announced now that they're taking submissions, written submissions, by the 20th of December. So what does all this mean, and where do we fit in? Well, essentially, what we will do as the HTG is to provide input, and we've already provided input. Reflected your concerns and indeed our own technical issues to the helicopter operators, to the CAA directly for their review, and we will be making a submission to the select committee, a written submission, and we'll wait to see if we're called to give any evidence. As recommendations come out, and we've already had a couple from the interim AAIB reports, we'll review those, and our role is then to drive implementation across the industry and consistency of implementation. We are also intending to try and identify any other safety improvements that are picked up either through concerns raised by the workforce or the work of the group, and above all to communicate with you so you know what's going on. So what's the timeline for all of this? The Joint Operator Review has been working now for a number of weeks. We expect to hear something from them in December. It's not clear exactly how that will be published, in inverted commas, if indeed it is published, but we will make sure that whatever we receive is passed on to the workforce. The CAA are committed to conclude their work by actually now. It's already, they're now drafting their report that from the work they've done jointly with Norway and Europe. And we expect to see something from them probably the end of January or February, and that will certainly be published. Transport Select Committee haven't set a date for their hearings, but as I say, they're collecting evidence before the end of the new year. And one which I didn't mention on the other slide, Oil and Gas UK are looking at a study with a number of threads to it, but it's about resilience. So in the event that we lose a proportion of helicopter services for whatever reason, how do we make sure we can still get people to and from their jobs offshore safely? And that could occur for all sorts of reasons. If we couldn't get heli-fuel, for example, or if we had more than one type affected by an adverse problem. The AAB final report, we don't know. They keep their investigations very close to their chest. We are trying through our sources with the CAA to get early indication of things that we might need to take action on, but we expect it'll be sometime during 2014, but probably it'll be the last of those reviews to report. So what else is going on in the background? Because helicopter safety isn't something that only happens after accidents. And I don't want to spend too long on this, but just give you a flavour of what goes on, and indeed what Andrew will tell you about at the level of manufacturers is part of that picture. So EASA, the European Safety Agency, they have a rule-making group on which our industry is regulated. They were already looking at some of the aspects there. And I won't insult you and read through those. You have copies of the slides. You can see the topics that they're looking at. But looking at the seakeeping performance if helicopters have ditched, looking at egress from capsized helicopters, and compatibility of life jackets and immersion suits and things of that sort. And they produce recommendations which are turned into rules which then the helicopter manufacturers have to abide by. So that was already happening, and there was a meeting, in fact, in August of that group where Oil and Gas UK were represented. The CAA also runs a research programme in the background, which is supported financially by the industry, and some of the improvements that we've made over the years, HUMS, for example, came out of that, and there are a number of things there. And again, I won't read through them for the purposes of time, but a lot of things there that are in train and being supported by the industry in terms of improving helicopter safety. We've got the size and shape study, about which more later, to provide input into both the design and the operation of offshore facilities, but importantly, life-saving equipment, lifeboats, helicopters, that sort of thing. And finally, we've got the manufacturer developments. The manufacturers are continuously improving their products, and Andrew will give you a good insight as to how the various models of helicopter have evolved and are evolving, including things like cabin configuration, which we know is an issue for the workforce. So I'm going to stop there, hand over to Andrew, who, as Les said, is the Customer Services Director for Eurocopter, based here in Aberdeen. Eurocopter do have a presence here in Aberdeen. And ask Andrew to take you through the Eurocopter story in terms of evolution, and then we'll come back and hopefully leave enough time for questions and discussions from the floor. Andrew.
Thanks, Mike. Righto, good morning. For a change, I won't start off with the EC225. We have had a lot of questions recently about the differences between different aircraft types and the reason behind those differences. So I've been asked today just to give you a very brief explanation on how the product evolves and how we how and why we include improvements into the aircraft. Just to put it into context, from a Eurocopter's perspective, we've got about 12,000 aircraft currently in service flying around the world, flying over 3 million flight hours a year, and we've accumulated over 80 million flight hours. For the Super Puma fleet, there's about 700 in operation, 80 operators, 80 countries, flying around 200,000 flight hours flight hours per year, and there's over 4.5 million flight hours on that type. In the North Sea here, we've got around 70 aircraft of the Super Puma family. So the product life cycle for a helicopter really steps through 3 phases. The first phase is the concept phase, where we really try and forecast what are the future needs for an aircraft, gather up what are those capabilities and the performance criteria that that aircraft may need to achieve, and then also identify what are the applicable and likely safety standards that will apply when that aircraft comes into service. That takes a couple of years, at least a couple of years, to go through that process. The next phase is the development phase, where we really get into the design, development, testing, certification. That takes a number of years, at least 5 years. For modern aircraft now, probably more like 10 years. A key element of that process is making assumptions on how the aircraft is going to be used over its life, in what conditions, what tasks or what missions it's going to be expected to perform. And then when we get into the in-service phase, you know, the aircraft can be in service for 50 years. So a lot of things will happen to that aircraft which were or were not imagined at the design phase. So during this support phase, when the aircraft's in service, say for up to 50 years, the configuration of the aircraft continually changes and changes on a yearly basis. And that's due to four main factors. The first one, and probably the most important one in this context of what we're talking about today, is the need to maintain continuing airworthiness. And I'll talk on each of these topics a little bit more in a second. Then there's new technologies that come along. There's obsolescence issues with equipment which is no longer available. And then there's always new missions or functions that the aircraft is expected to perform. So continuing airworthiness, there is a European Commission regulation mandating that the continuing airworthiness process means that we need to ensure that at all times in the life of the operation of the aircraft, it complies with the airworthiness requirements. So what that means is over the period of life of the aircraft, regardless of how it is being used, we need to make sure that the operational procedures, the maintenance procedures, and the physical capability of the aircraft meets the regulatory requirements at that point in time. So there's a number of different bodies which have a big influence on how we manage the continuing airworthiness. The first one, the type certificate holder, which is the OEM, so in our case, of course, Eurocopter. One of the key activities for us is collecting, analysing and coming up with solutions to problems which are reported to us on that aircraft type. Of course, we then report those through the relevant airworthiness authorities as well. The owner, operator or maintainer, in this case we've got Bond, Bristow and CHC here locally on site for the Super Puma range. Of course, they need to operate and maintain the aircraft in accordance with the approved procedures, but they also need to report any technical incidents. And then the other, say, key player is the Airworthiness Authority. Here for us it's a combination of EASA and the Civil Aviation Authority. And they mandate the requirements and the safety requirements or the regulations which we need to achieve. They also audit and follow up to make sure that we do achieve those requirements. And when we propose solutions to them on ways that we are going to deal with technical incidents or problems that have been identified in service, they challenge and verify whether those things are effective and whether they're going to be approved. So through that continuing airworthiness process, that's one way where there has been a problem identified, then there could physically be a change to the aircraft, to the procedures, whether they be maintenance or operating procedures, all part of that process. Another reason that we modify the aircraft or the configuration changes is when new technology comes along, and changes are normally seen here on the bounds of either safety, capability, or maintenance cost reasons. So for safety reasons, there's always new equipment being fitted to the aircraft which will enhance the situational awareness, enhance the capability, enhance the safety margins of the aircraft. For capability, the aircraft are always required to do more, better, faster, further range activities, and so therefore there's improvements continually being placed onto the aircraft to enable it to perform those additional tasks. And for the maintenance and for the cost factor, of course, there is always a drive to reduce the costs, reduce the amount of downtime on the aircraft, so there's improvements incorporated into the aircraft to reduce that maintenance burden and to reduce the cost. I spoke a little bit about mission and capability requirements. Operators always want to fly further, carry more or do more things with their aircraft. As a result, there's new capabilities, new functions either developed internally by the OEMs or requested and specifically required by the different operators or the different end users of that aircraft, which once again result in modifications and upgrades to the aircraft. So, in summary, to remain airworthy, firstly, to remain capable and to remain relevant, every aircraft in the world, every flying aircraft undergoes a number of modifications every year. So what this means is even though the aircraft that you see on one day may look the same as the aircraft that you saw last year, there will be changes to that aircraft which do change either its safety performance, its mission performance, its reliability, or its cost effectiveness. And this is ongoing all the time. And when we have an aircraft like the Super Puma range, where it has evolved over many, many years, you know, the latest version is a very different aircraft from the first incarnation. Right, that's about it from me, but I'm happy to take any questions now, along with Chris, or in the break.
Maybe we can